we want to jump into our session about disability rights, our civil rights, and how the civil rights movement influenced the disability rights movement. Now, I'm not sure if Judy has been able to join us yet. She is just running just a couple of minutes late, but we are going to be joined today by two wonderful speakers that we're very excited about. And I can give you just a little bit of background on our next slide about our speakers today. And as Carlene says, two living legends. We have two living legends with us today, really titans of civil rights, Judy Heumann and Dr. Walter D. Palmer. Judy Heumann is a disability rights activist and author. Her work with governments, nonprofits, and disability interest groups since the 1970s has produced significant contributions to the development of human rights legislation and policies benefiting children and adults with disabilities. Walter Palmer is a lifelong civil rights organizer, educator, and political activist. He is the founder and director of the Palmer Foundation and a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Social Policy and Practice, where he has taught foundational courses in American racism and institutional racism and social change since 1990. And so with that, we want to start by asking our speakers. Oh, and here's Judy joining us. Thank you so much, Judy.
I'm so sorry. I was on another event.
Your timing is impeccable. You have joined us just at the right moment. And we want to ask both of you really to tell us a little bit about your background and so forth. I mean, I want to start out by saying and reminding folks that, this is July, and as many of you know, the ADA was signed into law on July 26th. Many people celebrate July as Disability Pride Month, and the Civil Rights Act was also signed in July. It was signed on July 2nd back in 1964. So it's a big month for civil rights. And with this session today, we really wanted to take a look at how the passing of the Civil Rights Act may have laid the groundwork for the ADA. So we wanted to start out by asking each of you to individually introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit more about your background, what lit the fire for your activism. And you both have such rich histories and you've done so much. You're so accomplished. But if you could each maybe just give us a few highlights, maybe of the work that you're most proud of.
Judy, go ahead. Why don't you start?
Okay. First of all, it's a privilege for me to have met Walter this week, and I'm really glad that we're able to do this event together. So very briefly, my name is Judy Yuman. I am a 74-and-a-half-year-old white disabled woman. Today, I am wearing a red sweater and red glasses. I have brown highlighted hair. I use a motorized wheelchair, and I'm sitting in the foyer of my husband's and my apartment in Washington, D.C. I was born in 1947. I had polio in 1949. And I get to that level of description because there were no laws at that point addressing issues of discrimination against disabled individuals. There were emerging organizations of disabled veterans. Remember, the Second World War ended in 1945. The Congress was chartering a number of groups like Paralyzed Veterans of America, Disabled American Vets, Blinded Vets, these different organizations that till today receive money from the government to help them work with disabled veterans from different disability communities. And for those individuals, in addition to getting benefits as a result of being injured in the military, they were also experiencing what they hadn't known about prior to entering the war. And that were things like lack of accessibility. If you were a wheelchair user, or if you were blind, or you were an amputee, or you had a head injury, whatever it might be, there were really no laws there to protect you in the area of job discrimination, in the area of ensuring that housing was going to be built accessibly, in the area of discrimination if you wanted to take advantage of some of the laws that were allowing veterans and disabled veterans to go to schools and universities. They were not necessarily accessible if you were deaf or blind or had a physical disability. And the veterans really started in the late 40s, 50s, and forward to create voices where they were working at the local, state, and national levels to try to address these issues. I think it's always important for us to think about that. For me, another very important issue was, as I was getting older, like really my early teens, 11, 12, 13, television, and I think Walter knows this better than I do, but Walter was born in the 30s. There was no television at that point.
That's right.
I was born, as I said, in the 40s. In the 50s is really when television began to advance. And so my family, we're German Jews. My parents lost their parents and many other relatives in Germany. And they were they were 12 and 14 when they were sent out. So they very directly had experienced massive discrimination for being Jewish, and then being in the US with television, and the fact that they read multiple newspapers, and we were always talking about what was going on in our communities around the country. The issue of civil rights was something that became a part of our discussions. But equally importantly, and maybe in some way even more, we were learning by listening to the news. We were learning about a civil rights movement that I don't want to say was just being created in the 50s and 60s, because certainly it wasn't, and Walter could talk much more about that. But for me as a younger person, it was something. We grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. We were the only Jewish family on the block, but everybody in our neighborhood was white. And my mother later, in the late 60s, early 70s, when banks were beginning to do something called redlining, my mother was an activist with others in the neighborhood fighting against the banks not to allow the redlining to go on. So meaning that people from diverse racial backgrounds would not be prohibited from buying property in this neighborhood that was changing from an all-white community to a multiracial community. But for me, looking at the news, learning about the civil rights movement, hearing about something called Brown versus Board of Education, which I was very young. So did I really know that at all? No. But, hearing these words and learning about things like discrimination education. I wasn't a Black child, but I was a disabled child, not able to go to school. And I wasn't able to go to school because I was considered a fire hazard. My brothers and everybody else went to school. I had a teacher who was sent to my house 2.5 hours a week. So as I was getting older, I was beginning to see that one of the problems was, as disabled people, we were not a community. We didn't have groups that we could bring together and demonstrate about lack of accessible transportation, housing, denial of the right to education, and that other communities, other groups that were dealing with discrimination were not including disabled people, not that we could see. So I think gradually, if you've seen Crip Camp, one of the things that I think was very important about Crip Camp and work that was going on then is that younger disabled people who are fortunate enough to be able to go to colleges and universities were learning more about the rights-based movement. There were more activities going on our campuses. We were on our campuses and in our local communities beginning to form local disability organizations that were really rights-based organizations. We were really moving away from just complaining about what the problems were to really meaningfully looking at what we needed to do. And really, you know, the civil rights movement was so integral because when you were seeing all of the things that were going on, the brave people who were out there fighting and on a regular basis being so damaged by trying to create an equitable society, that I think that was very motivational for many of us. It was move away from complaining, come up with the solutions, demand that those solutions be implemented. And for many of us, and still today, we're still learning about how to do that. You know, who is a city council person? Who is a state legislator? Who is a judge? How are they elected? How are they appointed? Because they're done in both ways. How do we make meaningful change? So for me, you know, the 70s, 80s, 90s through today, it's been the ability to learn from other movements, learn about the value of working together with other movements, learning about the necessity of having the voices of disabled people be preeminent in our discussions, and really working collaboratively with others, learning and doing. And also, I think many of us, you know, here on this call today, as much as we must value the work that so many people have done and the laws that we've had put in place, we still have very legitimate rights to discuss and demand that the laws be appropriately implemented, because we know that our vision of an inclusive, integrated society where all people are equal, we are not there now. And in many ways, it's very fearful about what's happening with things like voting laws that are being passed that are truly intended to keep people out of voting. And now we're looking at people of color and people of color with disabilities and disabled individuals who have been denied the right to vote. Even though things have been improving, they were not where they needed to be even before these repressive laws came in.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank Carlene and Nancy and the Midwestern ADA organization for involving me in this. And Courtney, I would never have met Judy if it had not been for them. And every time I hear Judy speak, I'm inspired. I mean, I've only met her on two other occasions, but it is wonderful. As Judy said, in 2 years, I'll be 90 years old. I was born in the 1930s, 1934, in Atlantic City, New Jersey, a small town. And we were very poor. My father and my mother would have 8 children. We could hardly feed them. So my father did all kinds of odd jobs. What I experienced as a child growing up in Atlantic City was that white people lived on the south side of the town, closer to the ocean, and Black people lived on the north side, closer to the bay. And there was this separation for the past 150 years. I learned about race and racism early on in life. And what happens is it winds up being very subliminal. You don't get, it's not like stated in many cases, but certainly you get the picture. I grew up with 8 brothers and sisters and siblings, and all of us couldn't live together. So my parents had to farm them out to other great aunts, et cetera. So I learned about separation. We could not find work, and it was seasonal. So I learned about poverty. Now I share this with you because I think that who we are is largely defined, as Judy had pointed out, by where we were, where we come from. It will define us for the rest of our lives. And I became very, very interested and very curious about this duplicity that I saw. And what I realized, Judy, what I come to realize, Nancy, is that racism is also a disability. Black folks in American society become integrated into this society 2 years after the founding of the colonies, of Virginia colony of 1617. In 1619, Africans are let off in that colony. And so the beginning of race and racism in America starts. But it really becomes codified in the 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s in Barbados and in Virginia and South Carolina, where the slave codes were created. And the slave codes made anyone who was a slave, and particularly anyone born to an African woman that was would be a slave. So it was meant to happen forever. Carlene, this was meant to be permanent. And so out of that, America creates something that had never happened before in the world. In world history, there had never been slavery, race tied to slavery. There'd always been slavery since time immemorial, but no one had ever designated race as the basis for being enslaved. So no question, it created a disability. And what happened is, out of the slave codes, Blacks had no entitlements. They had no entitlements to healthcare, to housing, to education, to you name it, working, owning businesses, etc. And so now I moved. My dad takes us to Philadelphia. So I'm a transplant from Atlantic City to Philadelphia because he had no work, and he gets a job as a janitor in City Hall. But there I find, in Philadelphia, Black people live on the north side of Market Street and white people live on the south side of Market Street. And most of the Black people were either on public assistance or Department of Public Welfare and had part-time jobs or no jobs, right? And so it was being repainted over and over again. My father died when I was 12 years old. I became parentified. I became a protector, a caretaker in a strange town. My father would not be there to protect us, so now I'm the protector. But along the way, I had to protect my friends. I have friends of mine who, for the most part, didn't seem like part of the mainstream. Betty Green, I talked about the other day, who was born with one hand and had nubs on the other hand. I remember getting in fights about people talking about her and making fun of her. My friend, one of my closest friends, Donald Kelly, at 15 years old, on the porch talking with friends, and a guy comes up and pulls a gun, and the kids run. He shoots, and Donald gets shot in the back. Donald will be paralyzed for the rest of his life. I spent 5 years of going to the hospital every day after school to see Donald, and was there with him at the end, pushing him, coaching him when he'd given up, to come out of that hospital walking on crutches and with all the braces, but nevertheless. In my lifetime, working in the medical field, have been in close proximity and close company of people who have congenital anomalies. And the sensitivity, I guess, comes from all of my earlier upbringing. And the caring was there. Later on, in my own family, I'd experienced people or family members being born. My granddaughter was born with Down syndrome. Another niece was born, nephew was born with Down syndrome. I don't know how anybody could not recognize the fact that race as a disability and physical handicapable people, right, were really in the same. Now, I can't tell you that the civil rights movement, which I joined in the 1950s, even understood that. But those of us who did understand it recognize the fact that we were fighting on two fronts. And so I would spend the next 70 years of my life, from age 19 years old to present day, trying to find a way to help right the wrongs in American society vis-a-vis all the various forms of discrimination that people have faced, using the Black-white binary and the racial discrimination against Black people as the basis for this unification of fighting to overcome these disabilities.
Thank you so much to both of you for all that great background information. Just fascinating. I want to kind of follow up a little bit, Walter. You sort of mentioned, alluded to this a little bit, but back in the 60s, back in the 70s, and I understand back in the late 70s, you founded the Black Community Council on Human Rights. You were a leader in political activism in Pennsylvania for decades. Can you talk a little bit more about the council and whether disability rights were really considered as part of those human rights efforts at that time?
All right. What happened, Nancy, in 1955, I created, as 18, 19-year-old, I created the Black People's University of Philadelphia as a training institute to train Black Americans, Black Philadelphians on race and racism and slavery. And it was a basis for training them how to fight, how to resist. And so oftentimes when I've got engaged with communities, different communities to help fight for whatever the causes were, I create these entities. Now this one is 1978. I wound up creating the Black Citywide Human Rights Council. And the reason for that was because of the MOVE confrontation in Philadelphia. In 1978, the organization called MOVE, a largely Black organization, was under attack by the police of Philadelphia. And it wound up going into a major standoff in 1978. And then in August of 1978, after my being involved down there trying help to bring people of every dimension together into this Human Rights Council, it wound up being a shootout, which I almost was killed in crossfire down there in August of 78. And so it was not directly connected to the ableist community or the disability fight that was going on towards ADA, but it was my using these sort of entities, fictional entities, nonprofit, unincorporated associations, for trying to galvanize people to join the fight.
Fascinating. Yeah. Judy, I want to follow up a little bit with you as well. Talking about the 70s and thinking about all the activity that was going on around Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And I know that you were really taking a leadership role back in those days. You were leading a sit-in, working toward implementation of the Rehabilitation Act and so forth. And this was a question that Carlene particularly wanted to ask you, whether you knew or worked with Brad Lomax in those days, who was a member of the Black Panther Party and a disability rights activist as well. And if you felt like maybe at that time there was sort of an increase in collaboration between individuals or groups working on different civil rights issues. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
There you are.
Thanks for the question, Nancy. I went to Berkeley to go to graduate school in 1973. And I was in Berkeley from 1973 in August till 1974 in July or August, when I went back to Washington, D.C. I was on the board of CIL. When I moved out to Berkeley, I was elected to be on the board. Brad was not. CIL in 73 was really just developing. It did not yet, geographically, the city of Oakland is right next to Berkeley. And Brad lived in Oakland, and he was not yet a part of CIL. It was really an emerging organization. It was the first one in the country. So I was gone again from 1974 until 1970, basically 1976. Brad was getting involved around that time when there was a gentleman named Don Galloway. Don Galloway, unfortunately, has passed away, but he was an African-American blind man who was a big activist. And he worked at CIL, and he was one of the people who was working on helping to set up an office in Oakland. And he was the one, I believe, that originally met Brad and when I came back in the beginning of 1996, I'd met Brad, but I really met Brad more when we began to do work on the demonstrations that were in 1977 for the 504 demonstrations. So Brad and his colleague were very involved in many different ways. And I think, I don't know, Brad had MS. And I don't know exactly when Brad's MS began to have a bigger impact on him. But he was one of the founders of the Black Panthers in 1968. And by the time I met him, he was a wheelchair user, and his speech was becoming affected. And so the gentleman that he worked with was very involved with him. And it was very important for us that he be an integral member of the planning that was going on with the 504 demonstrations. And as you see in the film, Crip Camp, the Black Panthers were really pivotal in enabling the disability demonstrations to continue in the building. And that was totally attributed to Brad's work with the Black Panther Party, and the fact that people in the party understood why what we were doing was very important. I think there's a really integral message here, which is when people are accepted and really integrated into other movements, and you value the people who are participating, you're wanting to look at what needs to be done to remove barriers to enabling that participation to happen. And I think another important issue with the 504 demonstrations was, as is said in the film, the party viewed their support of the 504 demonstrations as part of what their objective was overall. So I think there was a real, in many ways, a hand in glove experience.
Fascinating times. I want to ask both of you for your thoughts on the relationship between the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the disability legislation that followed. Do you feel like we would really have those laws, or how the disability rights movement would have developed as it did without the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act that preceded?
I certainly don't think it would be as it is, because, if you look at Section 504, it's very similar to a provision in the Civil Rights Act, which addresses the issue of entities receiving money from the federal government not being able to discriminate based on race, not being able to discriminate based on disability. And, I know that people who are involved in the original language under Title V on the Senate and House side were people who are working for members who'd also been involved with civil rights legislation. So it was definitely quite intentional for the people who were working on Title V, of which 504 is a part, that portions of the civil rights law were moving forward or being, put into this legislation. Now it's very clear, I think it was in 1968, that Senator Humphrey and others were looking at amending the Civil Rights Act to include disability. And at that time, that did not happen because there was a concern, and I think probably a very legitimate concern, that if the Civil Rights Act would have been opened ostensibly to include disability, that it would have had a negative impact on the overall civil rights bill, because there would have been members that would have wanted to put other amendments on. So the fact that that did fail was a major loss for us, but one that I think we can very much understand, because the threat of weakening the 64 Act was really too much.
That's very close. That's very similar to the efforts to broaden the affirmative action. Affirmative action started off being a way to try to equalize the playing field for Blacks who had been denied economic opportunities, educational opportunities, housing opportunities. And then what they did was they said, okay, well, let's make it for all minorities, notwithstanding the fact that women were a majority. They put women in it, and then they put Native, Indigenous.
Disability came in 1973.
Right. And then little by little, then what happened is people attacked, including women, white women, attacked affirmative action on the side where they thought Blacks were benefiting too much, and voted against their own interests. Knocking out some of the affirmative action bills we've had. But I think that those are, we never had enough discussion, enough debate about how all this works. And I think that even notwithstanding those two examples that both Judy and I give, that, no, I don't think I agree with Judy. I don't think that we could have had the Disabilities Act certainly happened within the time period that it happened without the efforts of the civil rights movement. Now, remember, the civil rights movement, even though it was looking at how Blacks were mistreated and all the disparities, everybody benefited from it. Everybody. There were others that benefited, not just the disabled or the ableist community, but also poor white people. People who were discriminated because they were women. The women's movement evolved. The labor movement evolved. The suffrage movement, the LGBTQ movement evolved. Every movement, for the most part, in modern times, eventually had a benefit. And that's why in my lifetime, I continue talking about the fact that we're fighting for civil rights and civil liberties, but it really is a fight for human rights and human decency. And I think ultimately that means trying hard to see people not as disabled or Black or not as being women or gay, but to see them as human beings, right? And treat them equally. I'm not a fan of identity politics in that respect, right? I had many Jewish friends that I took up a battle fights for them in situations where they were oftentimes denied public access or fair treatment, equal treatment, et cetera, like that. But I think that the movement is underrated, and I think that the history has not been fully told about what all this means, what had happened.
I think it's also, Nancy, important that we look at the fact that it wasn't until 1990 that we ultimately had the equivalent of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And of course, because of different issues in the area of disability, like in housing, for us, housing is more than denying one the ability to get a mortgage to buy a home, or being denied the right to rent an apartment. It also has to do with accessibility. And accessibility is something that other communities have not had to deal with. So, I frequently speak about Rosa Parks and those before her, who were told that they were only able to sit on the bus, but in the back. But once the Selma boycott was successful and Black people were able to sit anywhere on the bus, if Rosa Parks had been in a wheelchair, she never would have done this in the beginning, because she never would have been on the bus. Mm-hmm. So I think there are differences that are very important. And one of the reasons why we so need to be a unified group of rights-based organizations, so that we can really understand the common areas and the differences, that exists, so we can also be much more supportive of each other in a genuine way.
Those are just some great points and a great segue to another question that we wanted to ask for your thoughts on from both of you, because there's a lot of emphasis on exactly what you're talking about here, sort of intersectionality, diversity, equity, inclusion, talking about different, groups that have different commonalities, but also some distinctions, supporting each other. And we're seeing more efforts along these lines. Do you feel like we're seeing some real meaningful change here? Or, is this just going to become another checkbox or a passing thing of the moment? Are we really seeing this sort of thing that you're talking about, people coming together to support common interests and common needs?
I mean, I think we definitely are seeing a growing disability rights, I want to say, awareness. There are more people with disabilities who previously did not identify in any way, shape, or form as having a disability who are now beginning to do so. And we're seeing this from Hollywood to just in our own communities with the formation of different groups. I think what's very important is, yes, obviously we need to be working with as many other groups and organizations that are fighting for rights of people, Latinos, Asians, Black people, LGBTQI, on and on. But we also really need to be really supporting disabled people with all types of disabilities and different ages in feeling proud of who they are. And I think that is a fundamental issue. I was talking to some people earlier today who are running a mentoring program. And the particular program that they're running, it's, I guess, a couple of years old, and COVID obviously had a major impact on it. But now that things are getting a little bit more open, about 16 of their interns are living in a complex during their internships. And they had a reception last night, and more than those 15, 16 interns came. And many of them were talking about how this was the first time that they had ever been together as disabled people. And I believe we very much need to recognize that inclusion is very important for disabled people. I believe in it, with every bone in my body. But I also think we very much need to recognize that there is importance in people who experience certain forms of community discrimination, whatever it may be, to be able to come together to celebrate, as well as to be able to talk about their experiences and where they get the fortitude and how they keep moving forward and what it is that they're trying to do. And when you're out there, when you're the only one, or when you appear to be the only one, you may become less of a risk taker. You're afraid of various things. So I do believe that as we are seeing more businesses that are putting their toe in the water to really sincerely look at diversity, including disability, that is meaning that there are more disabled people working in these companies. And as there are more disabled people working in many of these companies, they are beginning to speak about legitimate problems that are going on in the companies, like not having a policy, clearly articulating accommodations, who's responsible, not having trainings of human resource people, not having trainings of managers, not listening to disabled employees and talking about what their experiences are as disabled employees. And I think here also, we're needing to continue to support the importance of looking at disabled people in the broadest way. You know, we're not just people with many different types of disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, but we are everything we've been discussing. We are Black, we are Latino, we are Asian, we are queer, we are Muslim, we are all these different things. And as we bring our whole self forward, the discrimination that we're experiencing may be on multiple levels. And if we don't feel that there's an environment being created which allows us to truly discuss how I may feel discriminated against because I'm a Latina and because I'm disabled and because I'm whatever, then you can't really create the environment I think that we're ultimately trying to create. So saying all of this to say that, you know, I am vehemently opposed to some of our lawmakers who are passing legislation that is saying we should not be talking about the history, for example, of slavery. That is the most ludicrous thing in the world. We need to understand in a very vivid way. I mean, I do as a white disabled person, and I'm learning more and more, but it is very important because now I'm asking the questions of where were the disabled Black people, the disabled slaves? How were they being treated? What was happening? These are things that I think are very important for us to understand. But what I think is positive is that we are more and more conscious and aware of this, that there is more and more work being done in the disability community in the broadest diversity possible. Are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. But I think we are definitely moving in the right direction. I think that's very important.
I think that a number of institutions have set up programs for diversity, inclusion, integration, affirmative action, et cetera. But I don't believe that in many ways, I don't feel strongly about these programs. I don't feel as though they're aggressive enough. I don't think that they really capture and understand totally what the various populations that they're supposed to be including in works from. I think many times it's too academic and too scholarly, as opposed to being really dealing with people one-on-one in the raw, right? I started the course in 1959, and Penn became the first school in the history of American academia to have such courses, right? And what I've done ever since then, since we do the courses, and I started teaching them actively in 1990, is to make sure that there is discussion of these other disparities and disabilities, handicapable discussions have been with this program ever since we first started it.
You gotta save me.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. But so I think there's still work to be done in order to try to acknowledge the fact that people are multifaceted. They have multiple identities, et cetera, right? And I'm fighting with the medical school right now because I think that I'm teaching a course on American racism in the medical school. They see themselves as a privileged class, and they're not willing to look at themselves in terms of how they contribute and how they, as an industry, it contributed to racism. And the shame that we've had, most of us who are Black or disabled or women, any of our identities has something that has prohibited us in many ways from being able to fully function and also to be willing to seek help. We don't want people to know that inside our family we have people who have some mental challenges or handicapable challenges, right? That's ridiculous. Or people who, because they're Black and they're darker, they're ashamed, right? So we've got a long way to go in terms of trying hard to accept the fact that we are these multiple identities and that each of them has particular challenges, and we shouldn't be ashamed of any of them. I get excited every time I see a handicapped person working inside of a grocery store or a bank, or you see a lot more of it than you used to see, to tell you the truth. And I look forward towards trying hard to help them. People can be mean-spirited and be impatient because of our designated disparities or disabilities.
I also think, we can, I think it's worth for a minute emphasizing the fact that it took us from 1964, when disability is clearly not a part of the Civil Rights Act, till 1990 to be on parity with legislation. I think that's very important. And some of the changes I think that we've also seen over the years is change in language. And so one of the people here was using language that is, I guess, people first language, women with disabilities as an example. So, it depends for me. I am a disabled Jewish woman. I am a Jewish disabled woman. It depends on where I am.
Right.
But I very much use disabled as the word that is one of my identifications. I don't say I'm a person with a disability. I say I am a disabled person. And the reason I say that, and the reason I use the word disabled, is because I believe it's a word that, in 1970, when I was or 71, when I was involved in setting up an organization in Brooklyn, which we call Disabled in Action, we use that word because we felt it was the word at that point, really, which European disabled people were using. The word handicap, meaning a beggar's term, so handicap. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's something that we're still discussing in the disability community, because I understand also, and quite frankly, friends of mine who have disabilities who want to use the term people with disabilities, I'm very respectful of that. If you have a disability yourself, and that's the language you want to use, then I respect that. But I think it's very important that while it can get things muddled up, because we are dealing still a lot with language, that language is important. And we don't want people to stop talking with us because we discuss language. But I do think it's very important for us as disabled people to think about the terms that we use for ourselves. And, many non-disabled people get involved in the words that we should be called, the able disabled, the da-da-da-da-da, whatever it may be. And as Paul Longmore, for those of you who didn't know him, he was a historian, he had polio, and he ultimately set up the Paul Longmore Institute at University of San Francisco. And if you ever can go back and look at any of his materials, he has this great piece on language. And at the end of it, he gives a whole list of euphemisms that are used, and he ends with all boogered up. And I laugh every time I hear it. But I think being sensitive to that amongst ourselves also. And for me, it's really exciting to see how people with invisible disabilities are saying that their disability is X, but they are also using the word disabled. People with autism, they define themselves as, many people define themselves as autistics who have disabilities. They very much work in a very collaborative way, cross disability. And that's ultimately, for me, what we also need to be doing is really learning about each other in order to be as cooperative and collaborative as possible.
No, you're absolutely right, Judy, because language is very powerful. Language can impress us, but it can also repress us, depress us, and oppress us. And yet at the end of the day, it's language that also liberates us, right? And these conversations are so critical, and going back and forth and getting pro and con and getting people to accept the fact that whatever group that is the group that is the object of these discussions needs to be the ones to define how they want to be defined.
Right. Someone here wrote, the Black Panthers helped feed the 504 demonstrators. That is clearly true, and that's very much highlighted in Crip Camp. And as I said earlier, bringing food for the entire number of days that people were in the building really sustained the demonstrations. Without the food being brought in by the Panthers, it would have been very difficult to sustain the length of the demonstration.
I wanted to circle back, Walter, to something that you mentioned, because we've in the disability community we've talked for years and heard a lot about disparities in healthcare, and we've heard the same things about disparities in the Black community, and so I really wanted to talk about that a little bit. You were involved in healthcare. You were the first Black administrator of a hospital at a very young age. You've been very involved in educating medical providers. You mentioned that, working on race and equity issues in healthcare. You have your petition to designate racism as a national public health crisis. And so I would really like to hear just a little bit more about, your thoughts on this, your work in this area, and how that might tie into some of the efforts that we see about disparities in healthcare for people with disabilities as well.
Right. I was very young, as I said earlier, when I got involved in this movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Liberation movement, all the things that older people were talking about in the neighborhood and the community, and that I learned from. After high school, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and in the cardiopulmonary department, I studied cardiopulmonary care. And after leaving the university, getting my certificate, I went to Children's Hospital, and I was hired by Dr. Leonard Bachman and Dr. Siebert Koop, the former Surgeon General, and was to create this department of cardiopulmonary care. So I was the youngest administrator in the field of cardiopulmonary care to head a department like that anywhere in the world. One of the things I did was I continued working for social justice after work, before work and after work. So my livelihood was in the field of medical care, but my advocation was just this constant fight. It was a 24/7 fight. I was involved in this fight before Dr. King, Malcolm X, or Jesse Jackson, and I knew all of them. And we all collaborated and worked together on a number of projects. I was with Dr. King 2 weeks before he died. I was supposed to be with Malcolm X the night he died. I ran Jesse Jackson's campaign for president in Philadelphia when he ran in the 80s. But so I say that, just in terms of matter of timeline and not in terms of deference. But the thing Judy said something earlier about the fact that there are those who would like to sort of dismiss the slavery that took place in American society. And one of the things I've come to realize, and I share with people all the time, that if we do not tell the truth about what happened in American society vis-a-vis African slavery, we will never, ever be able to resolve the confrontational race in American society. Because it starts off with 250 years of Black African chattel slavery. You have to comprehend what that really means. And that meant that folks were kidnapped and brought from there. The only immigrants that were kidnapped and brought were Africans, and put under forced labor without wages, et cetera, and helped to build a modern day society for free, which helped American society advance faster than any other civilization in the world, right? Such a short period of time, 200 years, 250 years. So 250 years of this chattel slavery. And when there was every conceivable kind of, hostility. Medical field experimented on their bodies, gave cesarean birth, cesarean sections to women who didn't need one, or and did it without anesthesia, just to be able to see how they fared. All kinds of physical, mental, emotional experimentations on Black men, women, and children. And the whippings, the beatings, the trying to beat you into submission, the jailings, the torchings, the castrations, the hangings. I mean, it must be faced. I went to the Jewish Holocaust presentations years ago at Stockton State University. I mean, it makes you cry, just to see the carnage against human beings, right? And you can't run from it. People need to feel what it is that the Jews felt. They need to feel what the Native Indigenous people felt. They need to feel what the Africans felt. They need to feel what women, they need to feel these inhumanity. We need to constantly check the boxes in terms of our own personal humanity, right? And so in the medical field, a number of us were collaborating, trying to figure out how we can advance the notion of the government taking a look at all these conditions that African Americans are: poor housing, ghettoization, sanitation, lack of work, crime within the community, all the different things that were taking place. We created a group called the Medical Committee for Human Rights in Philadelphia. Jefferson Hospital was a major participant when we met. And our goal back in the 1960s was to try to get the Medical Committee on Human Rights to advance the notion that healthcare was impaired in American society vis-a-vis African Americans. And it also had a disparate impact on those who weren't African Americans, because everybody winds up having an effect one way or the other. So the whole idea was to try to make the case that America should literally declare that racism in American society was a national health crisis, had a disparate impact and detriment to all people in American society. Where's the case for it? Well, I made the presentation last year at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Grand Rounds. In the 1930s, after the war in Germany, America created the Marshall Plan to totally rebuild Germany, its mortal enemy, and then Japan, and then Korea, and then Vietnam. And so charity left home and still had people, after 250 years of the chattel slavery, facing another 150 years of Jim Crow, peonage, sharecropping. All Blacks who lived this time and experienced, this was tantamount to slavery, right? It never really ended. And so ending the conversation, denying children to understand the harshness of these things, it's in the same thing, the displacement, dislocation, destruction of Native Indigenous cultures, et cetera. You can never have reconciliation in the absence of truth. Truth precedes reconciliation. There can be no racial reconciliation in American society as long as we keep on hiding and pretending and making excuses. What it does, institutions and structures do not have racism in them. They're not innately made, they're inanimate. People carry their racialized ideas into an institution. They create policy out of their heads and become racialized policies, et cetera. Take the people out of institutions, right? And they no longer have racism in the institutions. So that means people have to work on themselves to try to deconstruct racialized belief systems that are both inherent in us, subliminal as well as openly.
I also think, Walter, that the importance of bringing the history of racism in the United States enables us to look at our history of racism, not just within the Black community, but racism in the Asian community and discrimination against disabled people, on and on. When you look, but because of the massiveness of the history of discrimination against Black people in the United States, really learning and discussing these things open doors to allow other discussions to happen. When we look at the increasing violence against Asians in the United States and other groups, when we look at the Holocaust and you go to the Holocaust Museum and you see that the first group of people that were experimented on and killed were Jews with disabilities. And the need to be able to say, these stories are painful stories.
Mhm.
That is why they need to be told.
Right.
Because they didn't just happen in a very brief period of time. And I think one of the other very important aspects of really looking at the long-term implications of racism is to really look at some of the points that Walter was making. And he could give us lectures for a couple of days. But when you look at the way cities were established, you look at the way highways were established, when you look at some of the history which is out there, and you see how divisions were created in our communities that ultimately resulted in poverty and the inability of people, primarily Black people, and other minorities who might not be moving into the United States and moving in those communities. We have to address those. And it's not, in my view, just for children. Adults need to learn what's happened because they need to be able to discuss it with their children. When I was teaching in New York City in 1971, we had Black History Month, and we already had a big volume of materials that we were supposed to be teaching in school. Now, as a Jew, as a disabled person, I thought that was really important. Most of the children in my class were Black children, and they needed to know their history, just like I needed to know about my Jewish history and was trying very much to learn about disability history, but there was basically nothing out there on disability history. That is really coming about, but we need to understand disability history. We need to understand the way various communities think about those of us with disabilities. Right. And if we can't look at that, we also can't even work as a community on helping to address how different communities view disabled people as objects of pity, as objects of hate, a curse, a blessing, whatever it may be, but not ultimately looking at us as equals. So I think really involving the religious communities is very important. When I worked at the State Department and I would travel, I would meet with religious leaders because the messages that they were giving and are giving can be very positive or very negative. And that's what I think, we have to see this as an opening of the window, not of oppression, but of a way to allow us as a society to take responsibility for where we are today, what we need to do to learn and address the implications of what's happened to millions of people, and to move forward with knowledge and thoughtfulness and a plan of how to address these very complex but critical issues.
Right. Well, the petition was born out of that lecture on Penn's campus a year or so ago. And we recall to have 1 million people sign this petition from all over the world. Anybody 14 years old and older can sign, and they have. We have people from England, Spain, Italy, Japan, everywhere. I have students all over the world, in the Middle East, et cetera. And over 4,300, 400 people have already signed, 14 years old and older. So people say, why would it be around the world? Because me and my students did a book called Africa's Gift to the World. Well, Africa's gift to the world was Africans were taken out of Africa and deposited in over 125 to 150 countries all over the world, on 6 of the 7 continents, in order to jumpstart their cultures and civilizations, et cetera, at the expense of their being enslaved. And America, what we did was our brand of racism, this peculiar institution we created, was sent out to other countries all over the world through war, through education, through commerce, through dollar diplomacy, et cetera. And then we have people who immigrate to America from all over the world who've been socialized with America's style of racism, and they come back. And so it's exported and then re-imported vis-a-vis through all these technologies that we have. So, my goal by 2025, our goal is to have 1 million signatures we can put on the desk. I know people say, why don't you go now? You know Joe Biden. Well, I do. I mean, Joe Biden's daughter, Ashley, was my student for 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania. And Joe Biden and his wife met me. They talked about me, talked about how I was a topic of their conversation every night at home. And they thanked me for all the things that their daughter had learned vis-a-vis these kind of conversations, these kind of teachings, right? But it's not right. I think the people have to be a part of this. In other words, you can't just try to use any political largesse or friendships. This has to be supported by an underground, a swell of people. And that's my goal. I'll be 90 years old in a couple of years or so. So I've set it around my birthday to try to get 1 million signatures.
Your birthday, what?
I set it around my birthday to try to get 1 million signatures, right? Help this old guy go out the world backwards.
I wanted to quickly go through a couple of the questions. One of them is, why is there a large portion of African-American boys identified in schools as students with disabilities? And if so, is that racism bias? I would say yes. I would say, one of the big problems with segregated classes and segregated schools is the same problem that existed when I was going to segregated disabled classes. And that is that the expectations for those students are low. The expectations are not that they will become high achievers. And the rationale for many of these students being in these classes is really very problematic. They're not getting the supports they need in regular classes. Teachers are not getting the training they need. And ultimately, there is no other way to look at this but to say that there is bias and racist experiences here. The other question that somebody asked was just curious around what some of the biggest concerns are around ADA and IDEA today. For me, I would say the lack of knowledge for the public of disabled people and parents and others about what the ADA really is and what the IDEA really is, and then having access to getting the support they need to be able to exercise their rights. I would say in the area of education, part of the failure is our federal and state government not putting enough money into education in general. I think it's really pretty appalling that we do not put the level of money into public education that we need to. And I think that is where we have to be making substantial changes, putting more investment into education, putting more investment into teacher training, making sure that teachers are coming out of school knowing how to work with diverse populations. And that's not just disabled and non-disabled people, but it's also learning about who the students are, where their families are from, different cultural norms that may go on, how students may be functioning in a classroom that one person might perceive as being rude or disrespectful and not the same for someone else. But the whole issue of cultural diversity is not being taught sufficiently enough. So for me, it's also an issue of staffing in our agencies that have responsibility for enforcement of the ADA, for mediation of the ADA. And under IDEA, I think we need a lot more support for parents to understand what their rights are. I really want to underscore here, though, the need for better teacher training, better pay for teachers, better support for our public schools so that kids, not disabled kids, are getting the support that they need.
And I would say that all of us, but particularly in the disabled community, you have to become advocates. In the Black community, you have to become advocates. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was over 40 million African Americans that were in America. Because I dealt with 40,000 or more across the country that were on the front lines fighting. Freedom is never really taken from people. People surrender their freedoms. And in order to have our freedoms and maintain them and keep them, you have to be on guard. And you have to be the checks and balances for making sure that no one deprives you of these freedoms. And so the fact that we wound up with the 1954 Brown decision and the 1964 Civil Rights Act was not enough. Too many people stepped down. They were off their guard. They thought that they had arrived. And in every instance, this lays the groundwork for others to come in and once again take over and try hard to subjugate you in terms of your thoughts and your feelings, your attitudes, your beliefs, etc.
Those are some just terrific thoughts from both of you, and we just could go on until the end of the day here, but we have a couple of more slides that we do want to share, which are gonna, and while we do that, and you all have really segued very nicely into what I wanted to ask you both to talk a little bit about before we wind up today, because we've had, and thank you, Judy, you addressed a couple of the questions that we had, and we had a few others, several that are kind of around the same issues, people asking for your ideas and your tips and strategies, anything that you might be able to share about what people can be doing now to advance civil rights, human rights, economic justice, all of these things. So I'm going to ask you to both think about that for just a couple of minutes while we share these final few slides, because we want to make sure that we do that. And these are some of the things about your works and so forth that we really want to make sure that people get this information. Okay. And just as a reminder for everyone, these slides that have these links and things on them, we created some handouts which we posted to our webpage on our website where this session was listed, so that you can access these materials and you don't have to try to jot down all these websites and things. So we really want to make sure that everybody knows about the W.D. Palmer Foundation and the anti-racism petition that Walter's been talking about today. You can find the foundation online at thewdpalmerfoundation.org. You can find the petition to designate racism as a national public health crisis and the call for a national dialogue on racism in America. You can find them there at that website, wdpalmerfoundation.org/petition-information-page. If you would like to sign, make sure you do that definitely before Walter's birthday, if you're going to do that. And look for these books. You can find these books online. I understand from Walter that there'll be some links on the wdpalmerfoundation.org website soon, but you can find these books online. Everything you must know about race and racism before race and racism dialogue, and Age of Justice Compendium. And on our next slide, we wanted to share a few things, some of the work that Judy is doing and resources. Judy's publications and podcasts, Being Human and Rolling Warrior, are available in paperback, hardcover, large print, ebook, audiobook. We've mentioned today, and obviously many folks have made comments that they have seen the film Crip Camp. We've had lots of comments about that. I think we had somebody say, prepare to see it more than once. This was an award-winning documentary on Netflix. You can find it on Netflix and YouTube. And Judy's podcast, The Human Perspective, where Judy has conversations with change makers. You can visit judithheumann.com for more information.
And if I could add, someone just put up in the chat a book called Alone in the Mainstream, which I haven't read, but I will look for. And I believe it's about a deaf student or deaf students being in regular education. There's another book that I'm reading called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It's written by Beverly Daniel Tatum, Tatum. It's a really excellent book, and she has been doing work in this area since the 1990s. or maybe even earlier. And the latest book is, someone else is reading Lederic's work. Judy, I ended a call with Lederic Horn. Is how I was joining this webinar. He's a great guy. He's a dyslexic guy who's a poet, African-American guy. But anyway, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria for me was or is very important because I am finding myself as a disabled person totally immersed in this story because it really also speaks about the segregation of disabled children in primary, secondary, higher education. And so I think there really is a lot of crossover that we definitely don't necessarily see. But I think by looking at work that Walter is doing, for example, you will definitely see the parallel for that in the area of disability, as well as for disabled Black people, right? But there is, I think, an overshadowing of how people with disabilities have been treated since the beginning of time, and how it has not been both documented effectively enough. And I think in all too many cases, many people don't believe that it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They may believe that aspects of it are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They may believe that no, a child with an intellectual disability should not be tied down in a bed, but they may not believe that child belongs in an integrated classroom. So I think we have a lot to learn because we have a lot to be able to demonstrate is wrong on so many fundamental levels and really work on what needs to be done to ensure that we are creating opportunities for people to be able to live together.
Thanks.
It would be wonderful if we could work together as a collaboration. I know Judy and I have talked about it, and Carlene and I have talked about it. We mentioned it with Nancy. I'd love for the disabled community to really help me take this lift as I'm asking other members of the Jewish community and Asian community, and really help us join this movement and share in this movement and share our stories as well as our individual struggles, et cetera. I don't know how to make that happen, and I hope there's some folks out there smarter than I am that can try to figure out how we can work together over the next year or two to try to get those million signatures on the president's desk.
Thank you so much to both of you. Let me just go through these last couple of slides, and then we'll have a few minutes, I hope, for just maybe some parting thoughts. Our contact information here in the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, if you would like to contact us, if you'd like to call us, if you have questions about the ADA, you can call us if you're in our region, Delaware, the district, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. You can use the good old toll-free number, 800-949-4232. If you're out of our region, you can still call us. You can call us locally at 301-217-0124. You can find us online at adainfo.org. And so with that, I want to just give both of our speakers the last couple of minutes to maybe give us your final thoughts on what we should be doing, how we can move ourselves forward. And again, to just thank you both so much for taking your time and sharing your wisdom and your stories with us today. It's really just been absolutely fabulous.
Well, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank, I do a lot of webinars. I do a lot of talking in different places. I can only tell you I can't tell you just how enthusiastic I am and how I feel about this movement, about the disabled movement, something close and dear to my heart. I hope that we'll have further opportunities to collaborate and work together. Judy, don't lose my phone number and my email. Nancy, you and Carlene, the same. And
So what I want to
try to
say,
get everybody to post this, our site, just spread it throughout the whole world.
what I'd like to say is, I think we've given you a lot of information about things that we believe need to happen. I believe you all need to be looking at what it is you are doing on a daily basis and what you believe is working and what you believe should be working, but there are barriers, and looking at ways of having discussions to address those. I think ultimately, we need to look at where we're working, where we're living, how are we advancing our objectives in life. I know for me, as a member of Addis Israel Synagogue here in Washington, D.C., they created a committee or task force 10 or 12 years ago, and it was basically looking at what the synagogue needed to do to make itself more inclusive. And one of the issues that we had been talking about for quite a while was they also have a very active social action committee. And finally, the task force has been moved under the social action committee, which is where I believe it needs to be, because the social action committee deals with issues like homelessness and violence and other issues, which both cause disability, and many disabled people are disproportionately impacted by poverty and lack of housing, accessibility, etc. So beginning to have these meaningful discussions in a way that really requires more commitment and drive. Look at what are you doing on your daily life outside of work? How are you living your vision of what you believe our societies need to look like? And for me, getting back to a point that Walter raised earlier, I think we must ensure that people are registered to vote. We need to look at making sure that people can, in fact, address many of these barriers that are being set up to intentionally keep people out of voting. We need, as nonpartisan organizations, which I know you are able to share information. So looking at ways that you can be sharing information if there are amendments moving forward that could potentially adversely affect the ADA. You're not taking a position, but you're sharing information. And many of you are, your lives are not just the ADA technical assistance centers. So really look on a daily basis at what are you doing to help really help ensure that ADA can become or can continue to become more and more a part of the landscape of the United States. And I think 504 and IDEA and ADA are definitely moving in the right direction. I also think we're seeing some very promising changes in a growing number of states where work disincentives are being removed, such as enabling people to not have a limit on savings or a limit on the amount of money that they can be earning and still be able to address benefiting from the Medicaid buy-in program so people can get personal assistance services. I think these are all very, very critical things.
Thank you so much. Once again, as we wrap up, I want to extend our great thanks to both Judy Heumann and Walter Palmer, and to each and every one of you who joined us today. So again, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet you, Walter.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Nancy. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Christine.
Be in
Take
touch.
care.